Welcome everyone to an edition of the Cloud Cafe around Vision 2050 for the region. My name is Jeremy Foyett. I am the co-founder of NEWaukee, and these Cloud Cafe programs we do weekly on a variety of topics. They are brought to you by Ginger Lazovik at Shorewest Realty and North Shore Bank. So appreciate them for keeping these programs going. As people filter in the room, we are on Facebook Live. We'll be taking questions. Please use the Q&A portion, or you can use the chat and we will filter those questions along. But we are going to turn it over to Kevin, who's Executive Director of Sewer PAC's organization, and he's going to take us through a presentation, and everybody will have time to have questions at the end. So Great. Take it away, Kevin.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thanks to you and NEWaukee and the sponsors for hosting this. So I'm here to talk a little bit about what's called Vision 2050, which is the Southeastern Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission's long-range land use and transportation plan for our area. Just briefly, the Regional Planning Commission is the official area-wide planning agency for Southeastern Wisconsin. We are enabled by the state statutes, and each of the 7 counties is a member of the agency. Regional planning agencies in Wisconsin are strictly advisory. So we provide any sort of advice related to housing, land use, environmental areas and preservation, as well as almost any piece of public infrastructure in the region. In particular, the counties that we cover from north to south are Ozaukee, Washington, Milwaukee, Waukesha, Racine, Kenosha, and Walworth. It's about 5% of the state's land area, but more than 1/3 of the state's people and jobs and wealth. We do have about 150 local units of government that the Regional Planning Commission serves, and that's who we see, in addition to the public, as our primary customer, is the local units of government in the region. So we try to help them with any issue they'd like us to look at, and in particular things that might cross municipal or county boundaries. So I'm here to talk about the long-range land use and transportation plan for the region, Vision 2050. But when we developed Vision 2050, one thing we did initially was look at the Milwaukee metro area compared to peers across the country. So we looked at it compared to 28 peer regions that are of a similar size or larger across the Midwest in particular, but then also added those of a similar size elsewhere in the country, and compared on a number of statistics. It's a fairly extensive little mini report we did, but a number of the conclusions of that report maybe aren't a surprise if you're aware of how Milwaukee compares to peers, but nonetheless were part of our impetus for the approach we took to this planning effort. So one is that our population and job growth is relatively slow compared to many of our peer metro areas. This is just the peers that are in the Midwest, essentially within 500 miles of Milwaukee. But you can see here that we are pretty slow in the population growth on the left, and also pretty slow in job growth as well over the past, 2010 to 2018, which are the most recent data available. So we are a slow growth metro area, but we are growing, although slightly. So that is a slightly different situation than, say, maybe Buffalo, Cleveland, or Pittsburgh are in, where their population is actually declining. In fact, Chicago in very recent years has also experienced some declines from their metro area. In addition to being a slow growth region, we also found that we are the worst or among the worst in racial disparities. Again, probably not a surprise to those of you that have been paying attention to what goes on in our metro area, but people of color are 4.5 times less likely than whites to have a high school diploma in the Milwaukee metro area, 2 times less likely to have a bachelor's degree, and 4.1 times more likely to have incomes at or below the poverty level. These disparities are more pronounced in the Milwaukee area than almost any other metro area. And what's on the right is a dot map of the distribution of people by race and ethnicity within the region. And you can certainly see the strong concentrations we have and the disparities and segregation in some parts of the region. Although, not everywhere in the region, of course, is segregated, but overall as a region, we are quite segregated. And then we found specifically about the transportation system, a few things of interest as well. We are the lowest in levels of highway congestion and travel delay compared to our peers. So not a lot of traffic in the area, which if you've lived in a different metro area, you definitely have noticed, but sometimes people who have only lived in Milwaukee for a long time don't realize how little traffic we do have. And interestingly, we found we do have or have had historically a relatively robust level of transit service. Milwaukee's quite dense. It's the 14th densest city in the country by weighted density. And so among other reasons, that's one of the reasons that our transit system does relatively well. But we, in contrast with our peers, have not been investing in it. So since 2000, we've lost about 25% of our transit service in the Milwaukee metro area. We're also one of the few metro areas in the country without rapid transit. And what I mean by rapid transit is, could be a bus, could be a train, but it's something that has dedicated lanes so it can avoid congestion, has nicer, more significant station locations as opposed to a shelter or just a street corner for a stop. It also has a number of other features that help speed up the boarding process and reduce delays and increase the overall average speed so that transit services can better compete with people with driving, so in travel time. So Vision 2050 was developed in that context, in looking at our peers and what we need to do. One of the reasons we did focus on our peers is that we, like many other metro areas in the country, are facing a pretty rough demographic trend when it comes to workforce. We are simply not replacing those the boomers that are retiring out of our workforce. And so we do need to attract new residents to the region. So we thought looking at the peers was one way to look at where we had strengths and where we had weaknesses compared to those peers. Vision 2050 is an advisory regional plan. As I stated earlier, we're an advisory agency. It makes recommendations to local and state government regarding land development and transportation. In Wisconsin, a lot of those decisions get made either at the very local level, so your city, village, town, or county is going to be making land use decisions and some transportation decisions, or statewide. And so the state budget, the State Department of Transportation has some control over, in particular, transportation investments and what sort of things are operated and provided service-wise for transportation. As the name suggests, Vision 2050, it does look out to the year 2050, which is about a 30-year design horizon. When we were developing the plan, we did have pretty extensive public involvement. We offered lots of interactive online opportunities to comment, a few virtual meetings as well, most recently, and a number of public workshops across the region. One of the things we did that I'm fairly proud of is that we did work closely with 9 community partners in the region that in particular were intended to make sure that we gathered input from individuals that maybe didn't have access or it wasn't easy for them to comment and provide feedback in the past on regional planning efforts. And so we focused really on communities of color, low-income communities, and people with disabilities for those community partners. And we thought it was a fairly successful effort, and we've continued that partnership after the plan was completed. This picture here is from a community partner event that happened last winter at the Milwaukee School of the Arts. So what does the plan recommend? What was the conclusions of this effort? On the land use side of things, keeping things fairly broad, but the plan recommends focusing new urban development in urban centers. This is obviously places like the city of Milwaukee, but it also includes areas across the region that have historically had development. So city of West Bend, city of Waukesha, Racine, Kenosha, Elkhorn, and Walworth County, those types of places that have been built over the past 100 years or more in our region. We really wanted to focus that development either in those urban centers or directly adjacent to it, rather than further out into ag land or open space. One thing we'd like to see, and we've seen some progress on over the past 5 or so years, is increasing the average density in the region. We haven't quite gotten to increasing, but we've slowed the decrease that has been happening since the 1950s. Which really allows, when you have that increased density, you can more efficiently provide public services and also is more likely to provide neighborhoods for people with a mix of incomes and different access to shops, businesses, restaurants, schools nearby in walking or biking distance. We also, in the plan, delineate where we shouldn't develop, which includes some of the important environmental corridors in the region and much of our primary agricultural land across the region as well. This is just a map of the entire region showing that development pattern. Basically, purple is the densest, all the way down to yellow being the least dense. Those white areas are largely current agricultural land or open land, but I wanted to mention the green, which is the environmental corridors across much of the region. I will say that this concept was first developed in the 60s, 70s, and that's really when the Regional Planning Commission, which has been around since the 1960s, really implemented it. At that point, a lot of the potential environmental corridors in Milwaukee County, for instance, were already developed. So there wasn't a lot of land to preserve in the county, which is why the green is quite thin and mostly follows the rivers through the more urban parts of the region. One other thing I want to note when we're talking about land use, because it's important to think about regarding what sorts of choices we had as the Regional Planning Commission when we're making advisory planning recommendations. About 85% of the land use development that will exist in 2050, according to our forecasts, already exists. So when we're making recommendations in Vision 2050, we're only playing with about 15% of the new jobs and the new residents and the new houses, new businesses, that sort of thing. So the new businesses only represent about 15% of the total in 2050. So there's not a lot of room to move the needle unless you're assuming that you're going to be actually deconstructing neighborhoods and things like that, which we are not assuming as part of this planning effort. So getting onto the transportation side of the plan, I did want to note I did want to start with the bicycle and pedestrian element. The plan recommends expanding on-street bike facilities across the region and really has some specific corridors, and actually I'll flip to the map here, some corridors highlighted in red, which are regional corridors where we're recommending what we call enhanced bike facilities. These are what have started to be implemented in different parts of the region at a very small scale right now, but hopefully that scale of implementation will increase in the future. And what we mean by an enhanced bicycle facility is something that puts a physical barrier between the moving cars and the people on bikes on the street. So concrete barriers, planters, moving the parked cars between the moving traffic and the bike lane, things like that. Something that gives people a level of safety that is closer to what you get in an off-street bike path, but on street. Other elements of the bike network include further expansion of the off-street bike path system. We do have a pretty robust path system already in the region, but anyone who uses it regularly knows there are some distinct gaps in, say for instance, getting between the Hank Aaron State Trail and the Oak Leaf Trail through downtown. That's a pretty obvious gap that a lot of people know about. There are other gaps, other parts of the region. And there's also some gaps in actual trail corridors that could be filled, in particular to serve some of the lower income communities in the region. And so we've got recommendations in here for filling those gaps, and those are the green lines on the map. I do want to note, for anyone who isn't aware, there is an effort called the Route of the Badger that is working to largely implement the path part of these recommendations. And in fact, we actually changed some of our recommendations for the path system to match their recommendations as well. So there's a lot of coordination between those two efforts. Before I get into public transit and talking about streets and highways, it's important to talk about a little detail associated with our transportation efforts. We are required under federal law to take a look at what we're recommending for transportation, estimate how much it's going to cost, and figure out whether or not, given current revenue streams, so current taxing levels and current types of taxes, are we going to be able to afford what we want between now and 2050? And the answer is no for public transit and streets and highways. So what's on top there is an average annual millions of dollars. And that's what we would like, or what is needed to implement Vision 2050. And what's on bottom is average annual millions of dollars of the funding that's available. So it's about a $250 million gap for public transit, and a nearly $400 million gap for streets and highways. Those seem like really big numbers, but they're not necessarily out of keeping or out of scale with what some of our peers have done over the past 2 decades for investing in transportation. So what do we recommend for public transit? Significant improvement. Really the focus of our recommendations around public transit are making sure that the existing transit service can go faster. So I mentioned rapid transit when I was talking about our peers, and so we've got some recommendations to speed up the transit system, and also making sure that there are ways to access jobs in suburban locations. Those areas don't necessarily have transit service today. Running a full transit system bus, 40-foot, 35-foot transit system bus may not make sense to each of those business parks. It really depends on the business park and the types of businesses and the way it was designed at the street level. And so there may be room, and really there is room for flexible shuttles, partnerships with companies like Uber or Lyft, or shared van services, to really make sure that everyone has access to those jobs in those suburban locations. Like I said earlier, 85% of the development that we expect to exist by 2050 in the region already exists. And so we felt it was really important to try to make sure that the business parks that we do have already in those suburban locations have, that people have access to those jobs, and that those businesses have access to the labor across the region. So this is a map of those recommendations. At the end of the presentation, there will be a website for Vision 2050. It's vision2050sewis.org. And on there, you can go and look at interactive maps of these maps, so you can zoom into your neighborhood or areas that you care about and see what the recommendations, how they would impact your area. So this is an entire region map, which is I understand, difficult to see, but few key pieces. I talked about speeding up the transit service. So a couple ways we're recommending to do that. One, in gold there are some commuter rail lines. So we have 4 lines recommended, basically connecting the lakefront south of Milwaukee all the way down to where Metra service currently ends in Kenosha, heading out west into Lake Country and connecting the city of Waukesha to downtown Milwaukee. And then also a commuter rail line that may be a little difficult to see, but heading up the 30th Street industrial corridor within Milwaukee. We also have 8 rapid transit lines recommended. Those are in purple. Currently, Milwaukee County, some of you may have heard, just recently received some federal funding to help implement the first of one of these lines between downtown Milwaukee and the Regional Medical Center. And we're really excited that the county has put effort into pursuing this. We think it's a great idea. We've worked closely with them on that effort, and we're excited for further expansion of that rapid transit system to really form what we show here, which is more of a grid across the county serving major destinations. So I had talked about the funding, and this is really where the fork in the road occurs. So what's shown on the slide right now is what we're recommending, and this new slide that I just showed is what we can afford with current funding streams. So the only rapid transit line is the one we already know we have funding for in between downtown Milwaukee and the Regional Medical Center. And one of the things that's really unfortunate about transit when it comes to funding shortages is it's not, because so much of the transit funding goes to operations, it's not just a capital project like a road might be. You lose transit service when you don't have enough money. It's not just that your road decays and the quality gets a little worse and there are more potholes than you'd like. You actually lose the service. And so this gap in funding is not only going to, it's not just to implement the plan, we actually have a gap in funding to keep our system. So I mentioned we've lost about 25% of our service since the year 2000. And we're expecting we will lose another 35% of our service between now and 2050 over the next 30 years. It's a really rough situation for transit funding in the region. And we're unusual among our peers that we don't have some sort of dedicated tax funding source for our transit systems. So one of the reasons we do this, one of the reasons we recommend such an expansion of transit is opportunity. So access to opportunity is a really important thing to the Regional Planning Commission, and I think it's important to really anyone who's thinking seriously about the problems that face Southeastern Wisconsin and the inequities in Southeastern Wisconsin. And so what we're showing here is the number of jobs accessible within 30 minutes via transit. So on the left is existing, and basically the darker red it gets, the more jobs that are accessible. In the middle is what would be accessible under Vision 2050, and on the right is what we expect would be accessible under the fiscally constrained plan. So you can see when you compare existing to fiscally constrained that we are seeing a decline in access to jobs via transit across the region, and really the only bright spot is where that rapid transit line is along Wisconsin and Blue Mound. Vision 2050, of course, with the commuter rail lines and the rapid transit across the county would really expand that access. It would have big impacts on the near north side and the near south side and other parts of the region as well, including the areas that have fairly substantial concentrations of poverty and communities of color in Racine and Kenosha too. So streets and highways. First and foremost, the plan recommends keeping or getting the arterial street and highway system into a state of good repair. We certainly have a challenge with that in Southeastern Wisconsin. Some parts of the area, depending on local government funding, have more of a challenge than others, but it is difficult. There's not enough funding right now to keep those streets without potholes and in good shape. We also recommend incorporating complete streets concepts, which is planner speak for making sure that there's accommodations for bikes, making sure that there's sidewalks and that they're accessible sidewalks and curb cuts and things like that. We do have recommendations for expanding capacity in some areas of the region, which means adding a lane, typically it means adding one lane in each direction on certain roads in the region. To address any residual congestion that might not be solved by investing in transit or investing in bike and ped facilities. That's only about an 8% increase in, only about 8% of the roads in the region are recommended for expansion of capacity among all the arterials. Arterials don't include probably the street you live on, perhaps. They don't include quiet neighborhood streets. They're the busier streets, only about an 8% increase there. And then we also have recommendations for safety improvements and things that communities can do to try to combat reckless driving as well. What's shown on the map here is where those capacity expansions are recommended. So what's in blue would be a recommendation for an additional lane in each direction, and red is brand new facilities. There aren't too many brand new facilities recommended in the regional plan. Probably the biggest that you can see is all the way down in Walworth County. They've been asking for that part of Highway 12 to be finished, connecting Elkhorn to Whitewater and then on to Madison since about 1975. And they really would like it done, so it is still in the plan. There's also an extension of the Lake Parkway to the south, matching the preferences of some of the South Shore suburban communities as well. But that's largely what's shown there. There is a line in green, which is basically I-43 between Bayshore Town Center and just north of the airport. And the commission, at the conclusion of Vision 2050, there wasn't agreement among the advisory committees that guided the plan regarding whether or not I-43 should be expanded when it is reconstructed or not. And so there's no recommendation in the plan, with the expectation that the Department of Transportation will study both options when they do get to that corridor, which is not an immediate, not in the immediate future at this time anyways. So the fiscally constrained system, like I said, there's also a gap, substantial gap on the streets and highways side of things. Most of that gap is about maintaining the existing facilities. So the capacity expansion that is recommended in the plan, of the $950 million a year that needs to be spent if we're to build the full street and highway system that's recommended, only about 40 to 50 million of that is related to adding capacity or building brand new roads. So almost all of that is for maintenance, safety improvements, making sure that ramps aren't dangerous and things like that. Those are the lion's share of the monies that are required. And so with the fiscally constrained portion of the street and highway element, there is less capacity expansion included, particularly on much of the freeway system as part of that. So we did look at, what could you do to address this funding gap? One of the things that many of our peer metro areas do is they do have a sales tax to fund their transit system. Some do income tax, some do payroll, but most do sales. And it's usually between a half cent and a full 1%. And so if you were to do a half cent in the 4 metro Milwaukee counties, Ozaukee, Washington, Milwaukee, and Waukesha, you generate about $150 million annually. And so, 0.75, 1 would do more. Any of you have been paying attention to the Milwaukee Fair Deal Work Group that the city and Milwaukee County have been working on for a while. That is an effort to get additional sales tax revenue for local governments. And those conversations have noted that at least within the densest part of the region, within Milwaukee, compared to peer cities, we have one of the lowest sales tax rates in the country. So many peer cities are much closer into the 7.5%, 8.5%. And so perhaps it's appropriate to pursue that. But there are other options as well. Tolling could be explored, gas tax increases could be explored. As vehicles get more fuel efficient, the gas tax gets less useful from a revenue generation perspective. So maybe we need to look at different alternatives. That's what a VMT or a fee or a highway use fee is. VMT fee is basically charging someone per mile that they drive. And that could be used as well and is being explored in other parts of the world and in certain parts of the country too. So something that we also do as part of our regional planning efforts is ask ourselves and review if the benefits and impacts of the plan are shared fairly and equitably, and if the plan serves to reduce significant long-standing disparities between whites and people of color. And these are also, we go beyond them, but there are federal requirements related to this too. So some of the language I just read off is in those federal requirements, which is why it's a little bit formal. But basically, does this make people's lives better if you were to implement the plan? And so I had showed this map earlier in the presentation, and the equity analysis populations that we focus on are communities of color, families in poverty, and people with disabilities. Population by race and ethnicity is what's shown on the screen. And really, one of the key reasons for the transit recommendations in the plan are these statistics right here on the left. This is the percent of the population without a vehicle in their household, without access to a vehicle, first by race and ethnicity. So about 16% of minority households in the region do not have access to a vehicle, whereas only 6% of non-minority households don't have access to a car. It's even worse, perhaps, this makes sense, but it's unfortunate. About 30% of families in poverty don't have access to a vehicle in Southeastern Wisconsin, as opposed to 6% of families not in poverty. So one of the impetuses for our transit recommendations is this issue. It's that the transportation system we are building and we are funding does not allow people equal access to opportunity across the region. If we were to implement Vision 2050, about 4 times as many people of color, families in poverty, and people with disabilities would have access to high quality transit than if under the path we're following right now, which would result in a decline in the transit system. And then this slide is just another way to look at that information. This is the percent of population with access to 10,000 or more jobs within 30 minutes by transit. What's shown in orange is right now, what percent of the region's minority and non-minority population has access to more jobs within 30 minutes, or 10,000 or more jobs within 30 minutes by transit. Same for families in poverty and people with disabilities. Blue is under the recommended plan by the year 2050, Vision 2050, and gray is what will happen if we don't try to do something different, particularly with how we're funding transit. And so really, what I like to focus on here is the gap between the blue and the gray. Blue is the path that we should be on, according to the Regional Planning Commission, and gray is the path that we're choosing right now. I do want to note, when I talk about all those transit services, I recognize that $250 million a year, $400 million a year, that sounds like a lot. But particularly when it comes to transit, we're just trying to get the region to match its peers. This is what Portland has built. This is what Salt Lake City has built. It's what Denver has built. It's what Indianapolis is building right now. There are all sorts of peers across the country who have made or are making these investments. And we're, other than small steps that Milwaukee County is able to take within current limited resources, we're largely not making progress on this, and we're in danger of losing what we already have. So that pretty much concludes my presentation. That's usually my call to arms, that we're not making the decisions we need to make to change the course of the region, at least when it comes to transportation and access to opportunity via transportation for equity. So thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Kevin. This is where we'll take questions from the audience. If you want to put in the Q&A, we have a list of questions here from Facebook Live as well. The first question is from Mark, and he says, and this is kind of one of the questions I think many people have asked, how do people get involved? How do they help support transition in the areas of the city that desperately need it? How do we help get funds to the inner city? Can you respond to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So as it specifically talks about, I'm going to focus on transit just because that's specifically what I just talked about here, but this applies to many other things. So somewhat uniquely, I talked about how unique we are compared to our peers. We are also fairly unique in that in Wisconsin, there's not a lot of room in the state constitution for citizen-led initiatives. So a lot of other metro areas, particularly in the west of the Mississippi, have referendums that citizens put on the ballot to fund things like this. In areas like Wisconsin, which we're not unique in this, the legislature has to first approve any binding referendum. And so where we have always struggled in Wisconsin is that in order for Milwaukee County or Metro Milwaukee or the city of Milwaukee to make an investment they think is important, including transit, the state legislature has to say it's okay. The state also restricts local governments from raising the tax streams they do have, which is primarily the property tax. That's currently limited below the rate of inflation, I guess is the easiest way to think of it. So each year, property tax levies generally don't even rise as high as inflation is rising in most cases. So that's really the conundrum we're in, is that our local governments have to fund a service like transit. The state won't give us permission to ask for more money and won't let the voters decide if they want to provide that money or not.
Another question, is it fair to make comparisons to cities that are growing robustly that have congestion problems?
Sure. Yeah, that's legitimate. I mean, I think the peer comparison basically included every city we could find that was of a similar size in the Midwest, and many of them nationally. And so we have high growth and slow growth. It's just that we happen to be on the slow growth end. When it comes to making investments in transportation, I think it's a bit of a chicken or the egg problem. Are you not making those investments because you are not growing, or are you not growing because you aren't providing an attractive quality of life? And I think this is part of an attractive quality of life for people that would encourage people to move to your area and become a higher growth area.
Excellent. A question in the Q&A here. How might COVID-19 work at home restrictions and lessons learned impact the transportation outlook? People, this is kind of one of the questions I had too, is if it's the year 2015 and everybody asked you what your 5-year plan on, I can guarantee that no one got that answer right with this. So how do you go forward with planning on something that could look so drastically different?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and that's something we wrestle with. Our job is supposedly to try to point the region our job is to point the region in the direction that we think is appropriate, but it's sometimes gets confused with, you got to predict the future, which of course is incredibly difficult to do. So what we're watching is how much of the work from home shift in particular is a permanent shift. And we've seen traffic volumes increase again and travel volumes increase. So we think that it's probably not a seismic shift. On the other hand, I do feel pretty confident saying that we have jumped a number of years ahead on the trend in telecommuting. That was going up just a little by little bit every year as more and more people started working remotely. And I'm sure we just jumped, might have skipped a decade or something in how many people will be working remotely once we get back or get to whatever a new normal is. Another thing we're very aware of and fairly concerned about is we've got a lot of our recommendations on transit. And transit now is potentially not considered as safe as it was 6 months ago. And so that's something we'll have to continue to watch. Right now, I'd say that our plan is pretty robust as far as options. And if you invest in those bike and ped options, you're more likely to shift people that way who maybe were relying on transit before. But when it comes to long-term, we may need to reevaluate some of those recommendations if we don't have a solution to COVID.
Another question, since Milwaukee since minorities live in such a concentrated area in the city, obviously with our segregation, can the city strategically target transit to service to the northwest side to downtown?
Sure. So the county in some ways already does this. So the county transit system, and just to clarify, in Milwaukee, the county owns the transit system, not the city. The most robust transit service in our entire region is in downtown Milwaukee and in the north side of Milwaukee. The highest ridership routes are on Wisconsin Avenue, up Prospect and Farwell, on 27th Street, on Capitol Drive, those areas. So obviously I mentioned the east side there, but those also are our north side too. And so there already is fairly robust frequency. What we've run into is basically the issue of jobs spreading away from that part of the region. So as jobs have moved away from that part of the region and into some of the more suburban parts of the region, just providing robust bus service in those areas doesn't necessarily get people the access to opportunity that they need. So as the city is focusing on moving jobs back into those areas is really important, but so is making sure that people have access to the employment opportunities elsewhere.
Another question, I guess we can look at two-part, is one of the things that I've been kind of against is the expansion of freeways that don't need to be expanded when it's just about they're busy at rush hours. Mm-hmm. And they're not even, and as you said at the beginning, they're not really, we have the lowest traffic. We don't have busy freeways, but we want to expand to 3 lanes. What was the thought work behind that? To think about expanding a freeway that obviously doesn't really have the capacity or it has the capacity to already fulfill. I mean, I think there's some areas by Bayshore where there could be some on-ramp reconstruction backups at certain times, but it doesn't seem like we need to be expanding freeways, and we could use those resources for different transit options. How do you kind of respond to that one?
Sure. Yeah. So I think probably twofold. So one is that's kind of a value choice that the region can decide to do or not. Anyone who pays attention to these, I don't even have to say I'll be honest, because anyone who pays attention knows this to be true. When there is a freeway expansion, particularly in Metro Milwaukee, it's controversial. Those projects get a lot of debate. As it stands right now, the majority of the region feels that those are worthwhile investments and that it is worth it to spend the money on reducing congestion. And in defense of that, typically a freeway project, the added lane is usually only about 15% of the cost of that project. Most of the cost is reconstructing the road from below, from the subbase. So you're talking about taking out all the gravel, redoing the soils, going all the way up, building all the way to the top. And the other piece of it that is quite expensive is the safety improvements. So if you're trying to reduce crashes and save lives for the people who are using that facility, you do have to, like they did with the Marquette interchange, make the ramps more gentle, curve them differently, change where the on and off ramps are so that they aren't quite as confusing for residents, or if they are confusing, they aren't in the lane that's likely to be moving the quickest. And so there's a lot of rearranging you can do to improve safety, but it's expensive. It really is. And so that's a substantial portion of the cost of a project as well. And again, as a society, we've kind of decided to prioritize those things. Whether or not you agree, of course, is up to you.
Yeah, no, definitely. I would just, okay, we do 3 lanes and now we save 35 seconds on our commute is always kind of, even driving through 94 now, it doesn't seem like it's any different than it was before, but maybe it is. What about how is this plan take into consideration, since it is so far out, autonomous vehicles and kind of their long-term plans?
Yeah, that was really interesting. So we actually just did an update to Vision 2050 that's about to be adopted by the commission, and that's what I talked about today. But the original plan was developed and completed in 2016, and we started the public involvement in 2013. And in 2013, nobody asked anybody about autonomous vehicles at our public meetings. And by 2015, it was like every other question. And of course, at that time, they were all saying by 2019, 2020, there will be autonomous vehicles. Okay, well, that hasn't happened. But there is a good chance that it could occur between now and 2050. And our primary defense to that is that we do look at this plan regularly. And so we will try to respond and adapt if as needed. A lot of the recommendations we think are pretty robust in the face of autonomous vehicles. So if you're talking about freeways, yes, autonomous vehicles might allow us to use our existing capacity better. But when you get to on and off ramps, the fact that there are still going to need to be traffic signals because there are going to be pedestrians, there are going to be people on bikes, there's going to need to be some way to control that intersection. That's the limiting factor to a lot of the capacity. So even if you improve throughput on the freeway, if you don't improve how people can get off the freeway from a vehicle perspective, you haven't really added that much capacity to your transportation system. And so those are the sorts of things that need to be thought about carefully. And really, is that the future we want either? And so I'm optimistic we're going to be moving more towards shared vehicles in our urban areas with autonomous vehicles, but I'm also pessimistic that that's not how our structures are set up. So,
and obviously there are so many people that were involved in this planning, so I don't want the questions to be like directed toward you, but what was some of the conversation? The city is shrinking, the region is shrinking. People are going to commute less if they're not, in the new future of work. Obviously that you couldn't plan for because we couldn't predict COVID.
Right.
And it seems to be a lot of expansion. Why is there no thought, or why is there no plans for road diets as opposed to the opposite of how much we can expand, which isn't really sustainable and hasn't proven to been sustainable, when we could probably do the opposite and get away with a lot less road?
Yeah. So a couple things to address there. So the city, is shrinking slightly. We'll see what the census holds. I mean, this will be an interesting census, of course, to see how accurate it is, but we'll see what the last decade actually held. But the county, Milwaukee County, has been relatively stable, and the metro area is growing still, slightly, but it is growing. And so we do expect about an additional 17% growth between now and 2050, which is a pretty slow growth rate, but is still a growth rate. And so that is driving some of the capacity expansion questions as well, or conversations when it comes to streets and highways. But to get to road diets, yeah, absolutely. So this plan doesn't specifically look at that, but we are working on that right now. There are lots of parts of the region, in particular in Milwaukee County, where some of the roads were built and designed before the freeways were built. And so you have roads that were basically built to serve some of the long distance travel purpose that the freeway does, and they're just incredibly over capacity. And that's part of what's leading to the reckless driving issue too, is there's too much space on those roads. And so we are going to be working with the city and the county and other partners in the region to identify where we should be reducing capacity.
Um, any other questions from the audience? Otherwise, I have a couple on the Zoom chat here. Or, otherwise, I guess we can close it up if there. So, in the plan, is there a comprehensive plan around green infrastructure being considered for complete streets?
Yeah, absolutely. So I may not answer the question quite right because sometimes green infrastructure means different things to different people. But to focus on one piece of it, so stormwater management is a really important thing in our region. Climate-related forecasts, climate change-related forecasts seem to indicate that the intensity of our storms is going to increase. So we're going to get not necessarily more rain over the year, but we're going to get it in more concentrated spells. And so worrying about stormwater and managing stormwater is really important. And we do have specific recommendations around how to manage stormwater runoff, both from private development and from infrastructure as well. When it comes to green building practices, we also have recommendations in there around that, around solar and on efficient heating and cooling and insulation and things like that too.
So I guess, let's see, I think that should be all the questions. Let's see. I guess just one more personal question for me. I'm just been watching a lot of trail development around the country. Obviously, the biggest is probably the Beltline in Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
And when you go to some of those trails, it's not just a trail. It's basically like a street, but for no cars.
Mm-hmm.
And there's private development along it. There's access to services along it. It kind of builds equity in neighborhoods. Obviously, it could do a lot. It's could bring up property values as well. But is that part of this plan? Is to like not just think of a trail as separate from how people get around, but also could be part of the development of the city?
Yeah.
Because I think most of our trails are, if you go down the Oakleaf, there isn't a private business on them. There isn't, access. You have to get off and go, which is fine. But I've seen a lot of new trail development go the opposite way.
Yeah, another good example is the 606 in Chicago.
Yeah.
I think we probably didn't get that specific in this plan. Something like that would absolutely be consistent with the plan. I think there's some opportunities in the region to think about doing that. One that I think has some potential is the trail that could be running up the 30th Street Industrial Corridor. That's an incredibly wide rail line. You could fit freight rail, commuter rail, and a trail all in that corridor. There's a lot of space there. So that's something that I know some entities in the city are pursuing, and we're very supportive of that. We definitely look at it mostly from the transportation perspective when it comes to the trails, but I agree that there's room maybe for us to do a better job of aligning it with economic development too.
And if I could slip, this is going to sound really contradictory to what I asked before, but if I could slip a recommendation in this 2050 plan is to make all the trails wider. And now I'm saying don't make the streets wider, but I'm making trails wider. I guess it's just different modes of how people use a trail, from like a kid walking on it to a skateboarder to a rollerblader. Not that I'm a big rollerblader, but from a biker, obviously a lot of the trails, or even where I live, I think they're 6 to 8 feet wide. It's just, if you have 2 kids on it, it could, not that it's just dangerous, but it also isn't, that, I guess, not flow, but there could be stuff that happens and stuff like that. I don't know if it's as dangerous as our streets are, but by any means. But has there been thought into, like, when we're building new trails, is like we need to have them a lot wider to have all these different modes of how people use them?
Yeah, I know that some of the newer trails that have been built, they are aiming for a 10-foot right away or a 10-foot pavement width because of that. I think that there are certainly places in the region on portions of the Hank Aaron, definitely on the Oakleaf on the east side, where even 10 feet's not enough. We definitely have joked internally about, capacity expansion recommendations for bike trails. So the entities
they're busier than ever right now.
Right, I mean, they are. And I do want to note, you are correct. There certainly are some safety concerns. Obviously, the safety concerns are a totally different scale when you're talking about something in a bike versus a multi-ton vehicle. But yeah, people could get injured, and either way, it's a less pleasant experience for all the users. And so I think that's one of those things that people would like to do that. The Oak Leaf Trail is owned by Milwaukee County. They would love to be able to do that. As you know, I talked about
We
transit.
could just
but
take all that money from 43, put it
there you
towards that
go.
bike lane thing, and just shift
There
it
you
over and
go.
not tell anybody anything.
Yeah, we'll just yeah, I'll also have to see if the state legislature and the DOT is on board for that.
It won't even notice. Any more questions from anybody in the audience? Okay, well, thank you for your time, Kevin. Can we send this out to the presentation out to everybody that RSVP'd? Is that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there a link
you
to
have
that
a-
maybe has more information on it for people?
Yes. Oh, that's right. I forgot the last slide. Huh.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, there is. So the one that is sent out, the very last slide, will have the link. So,
Okay.
yep.
Okay. I will send this out to everybody that RSVP'd. Appreciate your time today, Kevin, and take care.
Thank you. Yep, you too.